I'm Ellie. Nice to meet you. I'm Ella. Nice to meet you. Hello. Marie again. Christine, nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Ella. I'm Sugar here and Sarah. I'm Paulette. Christine, nice to meet you. Yeah. Good luck. Okay, we didn't have. Good luck. Good luck. Okay, can you please put up this in 15 minutes roll? Oh, sure. Do you mind if I borrow this?
Which Denmark are you?
WSTC.
Hello everybody, my name is Anastasia and I'm going to be chairing this round. This is Konstantin, he's going to also be judging in this round. Do we have anybody who would like to time keep by any chance? Okay, would you mind sitting here so they can see you when you show them how much time they have left?
Yes.
Okay, cool, thank you. What's your name?
Mia and Tanya.
Okay, Mia and?
Tanya.
Again? Finya. Okay, they are going to time keep this round apparently. If you want to measure your own time using cell phones or watches or whatever, feel free to do so. Do you have any questions before we start? Okay?
Yes.
Then when the girls set up. Of course you have the judges' feedback forms with you. Please fill them out for both me and Konstantin. You can give them, after the debate, you can give them to us. We solemnly swear that we're not going to read them. Or you can give it to your coaches so they can get them to the tab room or whatever. Okay? Cool. So if the first proposition speaker is ready, I would like to invite her to open the debate.
The extensive coverage on terror attacks does not lead us to actually stopping terror or creating a better society. It leads to xenophobia, it leads to citizens living in unnecessary fear and even illegitimate wars. The war in Iraq was literally started based on the media coverage, spreading fear and spiraling out of control. Thousands of lives were lost just because of exaggerated media coverage. We are very, very proud to propose the motion that this House believes that media reporting on terrorism does more harm than good. Okay, so before we get into our points, let's just do a little bit of setup and model. First of all, we define this House as the entire world, and we define terror attacks as attacks of a chaotic and violent nature with the purpose of spreading fear and often with a religious or political message. We define media coverage as all broadcasting media from TV news to newspaper and radio. It is firstly important to state that this is a believes motion, thus a principled debate. This means that we on side proposition have to prove that this media coverage on these attacks do more harm than good. Opposition has to tell us why the current status quo outweighs this. Thus, we don't actually have to provide a specific alternative. However, for a clear debate, we imagine things like a world would prefer like an international body to give out a specific release with just a specific only factual statement. This would be something like the UN, and that they may inform the citizens themselves, the individual sort of, this body must inform the citizens themselves, and we would prefer having no broadcasting, but we would absolutely like not force anything, but we would very much prefer that the media would not do this. Okay, so we have 3 points for you today. First of all, talking about the media. Secondly, talking about xenophobia and fear. And thirdly, talking about the purpose of terrorism. Okay, so let's get into our first argument about the media. So let's look a little bit of the incentive of the media and how the media actually operates. So the media right now in the status quo operates with spreading, of course, information and news, and they actually live or die on the fact that people are watching and listening and reading the news that they give out. Therefore, the media has a direct incentive to actually make and give out news that people actively will seek out and will watch. This leads to the media covering issues like terrorism that affects a lot of people and make people interested and gives people like a reason to read the news and be sort of updated on this stuff, and it leads them to disproportionately cover and report on these things. So that means that the fact that there are a lot more sort of bigger issues happening in these areas, but they report every single time there is a terrorist attack, every single time, and even report it so it looks like nothing else is happening in these areas at all. This is only sort of terror that is covered, like this is the only thing that's actually happening. They also give a distorted view of the situation because they have to keep viewers sort of informed and interested, so they ramp up the excessive sort of harms to these. They show it disproportionately. They do not give a nuanced view about what's actually happening in these situations. And because the people who are watching want something that affects them directly, that's a reason that a lot of people watch news that gives an incentive, no thank you, to look at what the news is saying, which the news, as I've stated before, lives or dies on. This gives them sort of also a reason to distort what's happening.
Ma'am.
They're not, yes please.
It's much preferable that people see what's happening and learn about it than ignore terrorist violence, especially towards marginalized groups.
What's actually happening and that you're making marginalized groups out of the terrorist attacks that are happening. You're showing something disproportionately. The news is not looking at this objectively. They're not just giving statements and facts, they're exaggerating a lot. The purpose of the media is exactly to look at this objectively, and they're not doing this. They're not showing this situation with nuance. They're vilifying the people. They're not just vilifying a single terrorist. They're vilifying an entire people. Sometimes, no thank you, an entire religion when they're doing this. This often happens to Muslims, for example. And the media actually has an active responsibility in this. They have an enormous amount of power. They shape public opinion on a lot of these issues. They do sometimes, to be clear about it, the fourth power state, because they, no thank you, give people the opinions that are sort of stated around in the news. This also leads to having an actual sort of creating political interest. So this means that the very fact that what the media is covering and what people start to look at and experience and gain opinions on, which is based on the media, which can be very distorted, is going to lead to policies and going to lead, no thank you, to political interest. This, as I mentioned in my intro, is exactly what happened with the Iraq War. There was created extreme sort of this extreme sort of fear and unnecessary like panic around an issue that never even really existed, and this led to a whole giant country going into an illegitimate war to actually sort of create and like solve an issue that was never really there. This is the power that the media actually has. So let's go into a second argument about the fear and xenophobia that this actually creates. So some of the negative issues that the power that the media actually possesses has is that the media creates this fear. Like I've said before, the excessive reporting that they do is also disproportionate. This means that they're not just creating fear about a real issue, because of course terrorism is scary, but they're creating fear in people who don't actually need to be as afraid at all. This means that they're not making they're not giving enough informed opinions to people who might actually be able to take action against this and able to sort of help or try to shape this issue and try to solve it. They're just making people afraid. And when people are afraid, they get afraid for their lives. They go into this sort of panic. And like I've said before, this also leads to them sort of having such an opinion that's shaped by the public that people like politicians with actual real power to shape and do policies are going to see what does the people want. This we've seen like in the fact of somebody like Donald Trump, who sees that everybody starts to be afraid of a group like Muslims because of the fact that the media has ramped up the role that they play in this terrorism. And actively this means that some politicians stand and say that, oh, suddenly we shouldn't let any Muslims in because the people are afraid. And they're afraid for no reason at all, but this is the sort of narrative that is actually shaped. This leads to the fact that this is actually hurting minorities, but they're hurting a majority of the minority. Because if we look at Muslims, we have maybe the smaller part of them are actual terrorists down in the Middle East who actually do bad things and blow things up and kill people, but we have a majority of that minority who are actually trying to live their lives, some of them are refugees who are fleeing from this, who are actively trying to get a better life, and they're not able to do this basically because of the media's fear-mongering and what they create within a country that is unfounded because of the way it is reported and because of how much it is reported. Therefore, also a lot of other important issues down in those areas get completely lost. We don't see the fear of the people who are actually running from this terrorism in Syria, for example. We see the terrorists and we see fear where we don't even need to be afraid, because it's not happening to the people in the West, it's happening to the people in Syria, and this reporting is actively hurting those people. Thank you very much.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
Okay, now if the first speaker of the opposition is ready, I would like to invite you to lead the debate.
When Malala Yousafzai was shot in the head by Taliban militants, she had a choice. She could either hide or she could speak out. And the media gave her the platform to share her story of increasing education and increasing women's rights. She was heard across her individual society and across the globe. And because we believe in promoting the voices of victims and giving voices to the voiceless, and because facts are better than fear, we oppose the motion. This House believes the media reporting on terrorist attacks does more harm than good. I will be doing 3 things in this speech. First, giving you a lens in which to view the round. Second, responding to the proposition arguments. And third, presenting the opposition's first 2 arguments, which are on our principal right and the rally effect, while our second speaker will present our third argument on institutional accountability. But first, giving you a lens in which to frame the round. The proposition must show that more harms come to society as a whole than benefits within the context of the motion, while the opposition must show why having media reports is substantially good. But next, going on to the individual arguments brought up by the proposition. They begin in their speech by giving definitions, but by specifically stating that individual organizations such as the United Nations could release a press report to account this same type of material. By definition, a press release is a type of media, indicating they make a massive contradiction at the very beginning of their entire case. But going on to their first substantive argument, They discuss the media, going into further detail about the incentives behind the operations, proving that media is only incentivized to provide individual news that people want to listen to. First, this is inherently wrong because individual news sources have different obligations. For example, Human Rights Watch is obligated to provide individual news sources on how rights are being violated across the globe. More specifically, they make a massive contradiction within their own point. They state that media reports on terrorist organizations because they are the largest issue to look to. But then they state that even larger issues are being covered up. This massive contradiction further proves that within the entire case of the proposition, they in no way are actually going to be providing individuals the information they actually need and deserve when living in this world as a whole. They continue to give the example of distorted news bias. First of all, many news media sources are not specifically subjective to individual sides. Second, they provide no actual solution to provide individuals information. The solution of the proposition is just to withhold information on terrorist attacks to citizens across the globe. In no way is this beneficial. Instead, it is more beneficial if we look to allowing news media sources to provide this information. They continue to give the example of the Iraqi war, stating that this is exactly how it was started. In reality, it was started by the oil crisis, but more specifically, publicized and made the entire global community knowledgeable about the goings on within the Iraqi war. More specifically, they don't actually provide any solution. It's always better to get your information from a reliable news source such as CNN, instead of getting it from the Twitter of a terrorist organization that is publishing the beheadings that they have every single week. Their next argument goes into further detail about xenophobia, going into the disproportionate allocations of news sources. First of all, people are going to find out about terrorist organizations regardless. After 9/11 happened within the United States, citizens across the country knew whether or not they checked the news. However, it is easier if we have more facts reported because then people can actually come to basic conclusions that they need. But first, your point.
Would you also prefer media to release matters of national security?
Specifically, media within the context of the motion is releasing issues on terrorist organizations that are attacking individual people. In regards to national security, it is objectively indefensible for an individual news source to come to the conclusion on their own, but citizens have to listen to whether or not these terrorist organizations attacking individual citizens as a whole is or not beneficial whenever weighing the context of the motion. But next, presenting the first argument of the opposition. Our first substantive argument is that we have a principal right to this form of speech. Two layers under this argument: the right to information and the freedom of speech. But first, citizens have a right to information. Basic rights and liberties should be given to citizens across the globe. This is the only way to ensure that citizens actually have the humanitarian rights necessary for function. An extension of this is the right to life and quality of life. Citizens have a right to life, but they also have a right to know what is going on in the world around them. If citizens are blind to the outside world, it has a negative impact on how they view each individual stance on the global sphere. More specifically, this inherent right provides transparency across the globe. Media is a main source where individuals can gain their information from. Specifically, if we take away media, we take away a main outlet that citizens can gain their information from. And since citizens have the principal, inherent right to know about the world around them, the world of the proposition violates the basic rights that citizens need for survival. But our second layer goes into detail on media reports granting freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is an essential right within the global sphere. If we don't give citizens or news sources as a whole the chance to report the truth, none of these problems will ever be met with solutions. More specifically, freedom of speech ensures transparency within countries globally. Media is an extension of this right, proving that they should publish what is important whenever terrorist attacks are legitimately happening across the globe on a daily basis. More specifically, when looking to a civil society, it is absolutely necessary that we have freedom of speech for news outlets as a whole so individuals can know about their surroundings. But our second substantive argument is on rallying around the flag. Specifically, there are three layers: increased awareness, support against the fight, and support for victims. But first, increased awareness. Without actually knowing about the global community and not knowing what is going on in outside borders, marginalized groups, specifically in Western countries, continue to be oppressed daily. If we don't allow people to actually know about the issues that are happening globally, we can't expect people to actually make a difference. Look to the example of ISIS, who has had mass amounts of genocide across multiple states with the CD's group. This oppressed minorities group became known about because of the media. The international community would not be able to rally as well as they wish to if we didn't have the media providing civilian support to stop this terrorist organization attacks. But our second layer is supporting the fight against terrorism. When people know about a terrorist group, they are more likely to try and fight against them in any type of support possible. When Al-Shabaab killed over 150 people at a university, the Kenyan government was compelled to fight because the citizens of Kenya requested, after seeing on media sources the mass amounts of killings that happened when people were just trying to gain the education that all deserve. But our third layer is the support for victims. An increase in humanitarian aid and an increase in integration comes about within the world of the opposition. When the hashtag #BringBackOurGirls spread across the global sphere, after the terrorist group Boko Haram kidnapped over 200 schoolgirls in Nigeria, this brought together the global community in search of the outreach to actually combat this terrorist organization that many have wanted to do for years. As a whole, we have shown you that information is better than ignorance. It is principally right and morally justified for an individual to know about the whereabouts of the international community. And for these reasons, we oppose.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 1 second. And now the second speaker from the top side.
Mr. and Madam Speaker, please do not let the opposition paint a picture of the media as only being humanitarian sources that paint terrorist organizations in ways that support, like education, and support these good things. Do not let them run with the dialogue that the media is not primarily news sources like Fox News and CNN that run with discourses that spread xenophobia, that spread radicalization, that create harm. Do not let them take this debate by saying that the majority of news sources create positive dialogues about terror. Do not let them run with that discourse. We can agree that maybe some few media sources spread a good dialogue, a good discourse about terror organizations, but we think that the majority of these sources far outweigh the harms that they have come, the ones we presented in our first, second, and third arguments to come here, far outweigh these small, few sources that actually present good things. Let's move into some rebuttal. First idea, which is this principal right they have. Now, they have first this principal right for information. We agree. We do not want to censor the media. We don't stand for removing the right to press or the right to free speech. We think, however, that in some cases, the harm that is done to an individual is outweighed by the benefits they have of knowing certain information. We think this is the case within these situations about terror. We think we protect the citizens because we actually create less terror. We will analyze this more in our third point, because the purpose of terror actually is heightened through the media. Now, second response, which is the freedom of speech, we think that we still allow dialogue, but by giving them controlled facts, we gave you the mechanism by which we still inform the people without creating this radicalized discourse about terror. We think this is important. We think we would have a release that is not a press release, but a statistical evidence of what happened, how many died, who was it involving, without having the media run with a huge discourse about, oh, it's the terrorists coming to get you all. No, thank you. All right, second point they brought up, which was the rally effect. They talk about the increased awareness, which is fine if you're talking about it's only Amnesty International doing media, but it's not. It's huge media sources that paint the picture of these radical groups being terrible people. They don't raise awareness, they create xenophobia. We told you why this happens in our second argument. We talked about how it creates fear because there's a disproportionate amount of coverage for those who are, for the amount of terrorist attacks actually happening, and those who, the amount of media coverage it gets. We don't think that it increases awareness, but in fact xenophobia.
Ma'am.
No thank you. Second response, which was this idea about how we support the fight through this, but we think that's just just incorrect. We think that, as we will highlight in our as I'll highlight my third argument, how the purpose of terror is actually increased in the media because they want this awareness. Their whole idea is they want people talking about it. No, thank you. All right, let's talk about the Iraqi war because we brought this up on our side. No, thank you. Okay, they said that it informed people about the Iraqi war, but what they have failed to understand is that the whole world forgets the Iraqi war because it was an illegitimate war, that it was started by the spread of illegitimate facts, incorrect facts that were able to spread through the mass use of media. We think it started because of the 9/11 attack, which was massively disproportionalized, massively disrepresented. We think the media allowed such a discourse to come along. Facts are more important than fear, but fear is created by the media. Media don't always represent inherent facts. Let's do some rebuilding. Let's talk about our first point, which was the media. And we told you about the incentive of the media. And they told you that not all media has incentives, but we tell you that the large media sources actually are also in most cases businesses, and that's why they have incentives to create news sources that people want to look, people are interested for. This is why they have disproportionate cover of terror attacks, because it's more interesting as a human being to look at a terror attack than to look at, okay, another 1,000 people died of hunger in the Saharan desert. It's more interesting for us to look at that. That's why media is going to choose to cover that in more cases than not. They are still businesses. They have to keep up with this fact. Now, we think also the purpose of media is to correctly inform the people within a democracy. We think this is not true in this case because in the status quo, we see that media disproportionately represents the people who are affected and disorganizes the group that is there. No, thank you. We think the third point within this is that there's they often look for quick headlines, clickbait. What is the media in the modern world? It's what I scroll down and I see on my timeline on Facebook. What is there? The quick headline that I read, or the quick news story that I hear on the stories. News is quick now. The nature of news is quick. The nature of media is quick, which means that all these terrorist attacks and all these ideas are shortened down to very quick sentences that people get in. That means they're not getting all the nuances, all the ideas that actually happen within these stories. Now, we told you about the xenophobia and fear. They didn't really respond to this other than saying oh no, it just creates awareness, it's not xenophobia and fear. Let's move into my constructive case, which is the purpose of terror. 2 subpoints. Firstly, in the Western world and in the home country. Okay, in the Western world, let's look at why terrorists commit their crimes. Mainly, we think, is to spread fear among civilians, to create chaos, and to delegitimize the Western world. How does the media play a role in this? Well, the media increases the amount of fear because they actually get more coverage, they get more people to know about these things happening, they create a discourse of fear among the people. We think this is a huge, disadvantage for the Western media. We think this creates exactly what it is the terrorists want. Simply said, we give them what they want, which is an incentive for them to do more terrorist attacks. We actually think that by giving them so much information, we are legitimizing what they're doing. We're saying, okay, you want a ton of information? Here, we're going to cover your stories all the time. We think we create more terrorist attack by doing this. Now let's look at how it actually affects the media in the home country. Now, in the countries of origin, the main purpose of terror is to gain support for their cause. This happens 2 ways. Firstly, how does the Western media affect this? Okay, the Western media effectively demonizes all of these radical groups. They say, look at all the Muslims, they do terror on us. Look at all these people that create terror on us. They are demonizing these people, they're demonizing huge groups of people, which makes it more likely for young people in these groups to actually join these organizations, because now they're actually having all their ideas confirmed. Yes, the Western world hates me. Yes, the Western world isn't going to help me. It effectively creates the exact dialogue that it is that these organizations want. It allows them to have this idea of the evil West. Now, how is this affected by the domestic media? Because that's also a huge important part of this debate, which is how the domestic media within these countries also have an effect on the situation. We think that's also a huge part of it. Now, we think most of the media outlets in these areas are controlled by the actual organizations that create terror. We think that a lot of times they have a lot of power within this. What then happens is then they create a huge a huge discourse of it being heroic for these people to do it. They create a discourse of why it's so good they're doing it. Look at these heroic things that they've done. They're able to like create a discourse that leads them to believe that it's a better thing to do, that's the correct thing to do. We think this is incredibly harmful. We've told you about the tangible harms that come with having the media do this. We do not stand for demonizing free speech. We don't stand for removing things. This is a principal debate. Principally, we think there have been practical harms within this specific situation that have caused the information that has been released to be more harmful than good. We don't think that in the majority of situations there is a disproportion between information and good and bad. We think in this specific situation we regret the way that the status quo has talked about terror organizations. We would like to change that. We have given you the mechanism through which we do that, even though it is not even required of us through a principal motion. We think they have no points because they completely mischaracterize the way the status quo works. We think they only look at these few small, uninfluential media sources that would not actually have a huge impact on this debate. Thank you very much. We're proud to propose.
Speaking time was 7 minutes and 58 seconds. Okay, and now the second speaker from the opposition.
On the opposition, we believe in change. And because change requires discourse and discourse requires information, we are proud to oppose. A couple of things in this speech. First, I'll go over some points made by the proposition, then I'll extend the opposition case, and finally I'll introduce the opposition's third argument on holding institutions accountable for their actions. But first I'd like to go over some points made by the opposition. First, I would like to address their model. They say that they are against the press, but then in their model, they say that the UN would essentially act as the only agent of press and release press releases on large international events. We think that a press release is by definition an element of media. So their model in and of itself advocates for the media. But even if you don't think that that model advocates for the media, if you think that that is a perfectly acceptable definition of something that isn't media, even though a press release is definitionally media, we think that it is wrong that one international agency, the UN, offers the only perspective on huge international issues. The UN is largely controlled by Western countries, like the United States, and we think it is unfair that the only legitimate media perspective comes from that lens. We think that discourse requires multiple points of view, and just having one is damaging, even if you buy that that is not media. So we think there are a lot of problems with their model. The proposition also started talking a lot about Iraq and used this to legitimize their arguments about how the media essentially perpetuates a lot of really extreme ideas which lead to a lot of irrational actions. Here's the thing. Iraq wasn't really a media-motivated war. It was largely politically motivated. The reason that the United States invaded Iraq was because they were interested in the oil assets that that country had. It was a politically motivated war, not a media-motivated one. The United States leadership had basically already decided that it wanted to invade Iraq and just used the media as a tool to legitimize it. The media wasn't the reason that that war happened. So we think that that is an invalid argument on their side. They also say that having the media in existence puts disproportionate focus on terror groups and basically ignores other things happening in those regions. We would ask them if If disproportionate coverage is such a problem, is the solution to that ignoring the fact that terrorism and genocide exist? Is that really the solution that they want to propose? If coverage is so disproportionate, the solution to that is not to eliminate it altogether. Furthermore, they essentially say that media coverage breeds terrorism. There is a really big problem with that. If the legitimate media is no longer allowed to exist, if it does so much harm, then what is the alternative to that? If two planes fly into two gigantic skyscrapers in New York, people are going to find out about it. It's just a question of where they are going to find out about it. Are they going to find out about it through the legitimate media, or are they going to find out about it through an ISIS video? Yes.
How do you have any way of, like, securing if the media is legitimate? Like, do you have any, like, way of saying that?
Look, we think that it is always better that people find out about terrorist incidents through an organization like Der Spiegel or CNN, rather than ISIS's Twitter feed. Because if the legitimate media is not allowed to exist, then the only sources of information are going to be the radical groups that perpetuate these ideas. That is going to be the only perspective. So we think that having those as the dominant perspective actually increases radicalization and furthers the harms that the proposition is so vehemently fighting against. We think that having the legitimate media empowered and allowing for this discourse, allowing for a lot of different ideas, is better than just having one perspective, namely being an illegitimate one or one of a terrorist organization or your grandmother's Twitter feed. But now on to a couple of things that we bring up in our case. So our first argument was this principled argument. We think that the right to free speech should always be protected. People's right to know about what is going on in the world is critical for a functioning democratic society. However, in their second speech, they say that they don't stand for censorship. We think this is interesting because they are definitionally, on their side, censoring the press. They are saying that the press cannot report on certain things. That is definitionally censorship, and we believe that it is completely wrong. They also say that huge media sources are really bad, but again, Der Spiegel and CNN are vastly preferable to ISIS's Twitter feed or your grandmother's. They basically completely ignore our second argument on rallying awareness for these causes and generating support. They don't engage with that argument at all, and we think that this is incredibly important. On that side, we would also like to bring up a couple of additional examples. Sarah, in her first speech, talked a lot about how reporting on these issues brings attention to them and supports minority groups that are violated by terrorist attacks. She mentioned the example of Yazidis being attacked by ISIS. Furthermore, after these terrorist attacks, if there is media coverage, then people from around the world rally and support and offer humanitarian aid to the victims of these acts of violence. Furthermore, if people know about the violent acts of terrorism and are able to get mad about them, then that inspires governments to take action. For example, massive media reporting increases the desire to fight terrorism, which has inspired countries like the United States and Britain to offer support to organizations like the Peshmerga, which as to date has been the most effective body fighting against ISIS. But now I'd like to move on to our final substantive argument on holding institutions accountable for their actions. We have two layers under this. The first is government-sponsored terrorism. In the 70s, for example, the French DGSE, which is their special forces group, bombed the Rainbow Warrior. What is the Rainbow Warrior? It was a boat owned by the Greenpeace organization, an environmental group whose message the government wanted to suppress. This group wanted a lot of environmental reform, and France wasn't too happy about that, so they bombed Greenpeace's boat. That is incredibly unacceptable and is institutionalized oppression perpetuated by government-sponsored terrorism. Another example of government-sponsored terrorism occurred in 2014. Israel invaded the Gaza Strip during a territorial conflict with Palestine and killed 1,500 Palestinian civilians, 500 of whom were children. We think this is unacceptable and is absolutely an act of terrorism. Now let's move on to our second layer, namely the effect of public backlash on these issues. These events were obviously newsworthy and garnered a lot of media attention. People were outraged about these abuses perpetuated by these governments. In France, this meant that because of media coverage, the government was roundly condemned by various civil rights groups. In Israel, their reputation was harmed and their relations with other countries were harmed as well. Basically, the bottom line was this. Media coverage hugely embarrassed these countries and provided a massive incentive for them not to perpetuate those acts again in the future. Because media coverage draws attention to injustices and encourages discourse about those injustices, it also inspires change and holds corrupt governments and governments that are abusing their people accountable for their actions. We believe that information is always better than ignorance, and the only way that you're going to inspire change is to have people know about the things that are going on in the world. And because we believe principally in free speech and practically in having an informed populace that is able to make meaningful decisions and informed decisions, we are very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 3 seconds. Okay, and now I invite the third speaker from the proposition.
To opposition, this debate is only about free speech. It is about whether media should be allowed to speak up. This is not today's debate, ladies and gentlemen. Today's debate is about looking at the specific harms and benefits that occur from this media coverage. It's not about whether the media has a right to say things. It's not about whether the media has a right to criticize the government. It's about whether or not this is beneficial to the country and to citizens. Okay. After having cleared that up, let's quickly look at some model and burden issues that have been brought forward by team opposition. So they told you that we contradict ourselves when we say that the UN can release a press statement, because that is inherently media coverage. So we tell you, firstly, this is, as we told you very clearly in our first speech, this is only neutral information, facts such as death toll, what country did this happen in, what date, etc. But secondly, we tell you that this is issued by the UN, which is a neutral body consisting of all nations. Therefore, it wouldn't be skewed towards like one specific government, because all nations are in the UN, right? Therefore, we think this is a neutral, not media coverage. We think the media coverage that is, no thank you, that is harmful is the excessive media reportings like that keep adding like details and talking about all these things. So we think essentially we're not contradicting ourselves. Let's move into the three themes of today's debate. The first one is the nature of this information, the media information. The second one is the effect this has on policies, and the third one is the effect this has on terror. Let's move into the first one, the nature of info. Because they tell you that the citizens have a right to information, right? The citizens have a right to know what's going on. Essentially, we tell you that this is not what's happening in the status quo, right? Firstly, on our side of the house, we still give the citizens information, right? No, thank you. We still give them these specific facts from the UN, so you can't say that like we're just ignoring terrorist attacks. Secondly, though, we brought you all this analysis of why the media are not necessarily true. This was our entire first point about how the media incentives means that there is disproportionate coverage. What you told us was just, oh yeah, but the media focuses on the large issues, right? It focuses on the right issues. We analyzed very clearly why it's not. It's not because the media is a business. The media lives to survive, and the media does this by appealing to people's fears, by appealing to these vivid images that people remember, because that's, no thank you, what leads people to click on an article on Facebook. No thank you. Therefore, the media has an incentive to like portray those issues that are pervasive to people, and that's why the media is not necessarily portraying the facts as they are, right? Okay, but they then told you that like, okay, so it's better that we have some information through like professional media rather than sort of your grandmother's Twitter feed, right? So firstly, we told you that they have this UN-issued information, which is very neutral and which is going to give them the information that they need. But secondly, we're also against like ISIS's Twitter feed. We're against all media that are schooling out portraying these terrorist attacks, and we told you that very clearly in a model. I'll take it if you want.
You provide citizens no other alternative than to go to these terrorist organizations' Twitter feed, or apparently just look at a few statistics published by an organization.
Yes, we think those statistics published by an organization is very reasonable information for these citizens. Thank you. Okay, no thank you. But then lastly, we tell you about this right to information. You told us about the right to information and the accountability of the government, but we tell you that the government also has a responsibility to protect its citizens, and that can outweigh this, right? We asked you a POI in your first speech about whether you release information about national security, which you never actually responded to, because the crucial issue here is that some things, we don't release some things because it can jeopardize a country's safety, right? If it has tremendous harms, then we don't release this information just because the citizen has a right to information. We think the government has also a responsibility, and a more important responsibility, no thank you, to protect its citizens. And if we don't protect our citizens, if we have unreasonable policies and bad consequences with this, then we shouldn't let this happen. Lastly, quickly, they just told you this idea about freedom of speech. As I told you in my intro, we don't violate freedom of speech on our side of the house. We just prefer that media would not focus so excessively on this. We're not saying that we would ban them from doing so. Yeah. Okay, so let's move into the second theme of today's debate, about the effects of these policies. Because we analyzed very clearly in our first speech why the media has an impact on policy. It has because of this cascading effect, right? When the media portrays something, that is what the population comes to see as the important issues. That's what the population comes to care about, because the media is their primary source of information. No thank you. Therefore, that means that the public will not be more interested in the topic. They'll want to know more about this. The media, in turn, to please the population, portrays this more, and in the end, there has been so much media coverage, so much public discourse about this, that the politicians have to act on this, right? They have to cater to the voters, they have to cater to the things that the media make the voters care about. So therefore, media has a huge impact, and as I told you in my first theme, when the media is not always neutral, that leads to these horrible, horrible consequences. Let's just deal with the example of the war in Iraq, which has been very contentious in this debate. So they told us the war in Iraq was only because the government was motivated to drill oil, right? Yes, okay, well, that's true, but that might be true, but the main point is that the government in the US used the media to justify their actions, right? They did this because the media wiped up all this fear. They wiped up all this fear of terrorism, of Muslims, of Middle Eastern countries, and that's why they were able to do this, right? If they just said, oh, well, we just want to drill oil, they wouldn't have been able to actually do this, right? So we told you on our side of the house how we changed the discourse about foreigners, right? Because the media tends to portray terrorists as Muslims and all these things because there is this disproportionate coverage we already told you about. We told you this is firstly incredibly harmful to minorities, which you really heard no response to whatsoever. It's really harmful to these minorities that they're excluded from society and portrayed in this way. It is the media that has directly linked ISIS to Islam, which is absolutely not true. It's definitely not the majority of Muslims that are terrorists, of course, but that is what we come to see as when the media portrays it like that. We also told you how we down-prioritize other important issues because the media doesn't necessarily focus on the most important things. While, of course, terrorist attacks are important and an issue, it's not the only problem that's going on in the world, and definitely not the only thing the Western world should be caring about. We down-prioritize other issues, such as global warming, such as economic policies, and all these things actually affect the country much more because the media doesn't want to portray that. Okay, let's lastly look at the third theme. Oh wait, yeah, actually, they have this point about how they're, if we have no information, we have no awareness. So, we have three responses to this. So first one, we tell you this really limited impact on a random citizen in the West getting a little more information about this. We show you the status quo, where essentially the discourse is not so much about, oh, we better stop the war in Syria right now. No, thank you. The discourse is more about, let's keep these terrorist refugees out of our country. That's what the discourse is really about. We don't think it necessarily spouts all this action. Secondly, we told you about the false information, how it can also lead to unreasonable decision and take focus away from the real issues. But thirdly, we think that it's just unreasonable to assume that governments will not act in these just because the media isn't talking about it, right? These issues are huge issues like the war in Syria. The government isn't just going to say, oh, the media isn't portraying it, so we're just not going to deal with it. The government is definitely still going to deal with these issues. Let's move into the last theme about the effects on terror. So we told you, which really heard no response to, about how this essentially actively supports terrorism because the purpose of terrorism is to get attention, to spread fear, and the media is an excellent platform for them to do this. We heard no response to this. We think on our side of the house we reduce terrorist attacks because they don't get what they want, right? We also told you about how the local media will glorify these terrorists and how that's also incredibly harmful. That's the ISIS Twitter feed that we also think is harmful, right? They gave you this last point about like state-sponsored terrorism, and again, yes, we also oppose that. We oppose when the state-sponsored media like portray these issues in such a way. That's also something we're opposed to. So because this debate is not about free speech, but because of this debate is about the harms of this coverage, this specific coverage that outweigh the benefits we've taken today's debate. Thank you.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 18 seconds. Okay, and now the third speaker from Cyprus.
All right, is everybody ready?
Mhm.
Then I'll begin. In Israel, a Palestinian child was murdered by a handful of Israeli terrorists. Because of media outrage, as a result, a couple of things happened. First of all, people rallied more around the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions movement. But furthermore, Prime Minister Netanyahu was forced to actually make a statement about why these actions were wrong and why they were, yes, terrorism. Without this media pressure, the violence against Palestinians and many other groups attacked by terrorists every single day would go unheard of. In this speech, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, briefly, I'll discuss the lens through which we should view the round, and then I will talk to you about 3 questions you should view this round through. First, who is principally right? Second, who helps innocent people? And third, who most effectively fights terror? But let's start with this lens. Remember, we both agree that we have to weigh the benefits of the media's coverage of terrorist attacks, but what we tell you very specifically is that we have to talk about the voice that victims are given and how they are heard, and that is not through a report of just statistics. But furthermore, we tell you that you have to evaluate what's principally right, what's being done to protect democracy and victims, but as well, we tell you the practical benefits of this. Don't let them misconstrue our arguments as being just about free speech, because that's entirely untrue. With that, let's go on to the first question of today's round, which is who is principally right? Now, the first thing that we tell you about is freedom of speech. Now, they tell you that they don't want to censor anyone, but what they also tell you is that in their world, the only source of media out there would be this UN press release. That is censorship. But furthermore, not only are they censoring media, but they're censoring the voice of victims as well. I'll take your question in a minute. Well, remember, we tell you at the beginning of the round about Malala, who after she was attacked by the Taliban for just pursuing an education, not only spoke out about education, not only spoke out about women's rights, but had the opportunity to speak out about other critical social issues as well, like the human impact of drone strikes. Without media coverage, which they say is sensationalized, she would have been just another face in the crowd. But before I move on to the next part of this argument.
Okay, so when we say that we only prefer media to not portray these things as excessively as they do, now how are we violating free speech?
Because you're saying that the UN should be the source through which the speech is given, and if the UN is just reporting, then nothing's really changing from now, and you can't claim this is a proper solution. Now, the second part of this principal argument is whether the UN is a better alternative. Now, we tell you that a press release, yes, is disseminated through media. That's how people access it, so they are by definition looking towards media, but they also ignore the analysis we make that by and large, the UN is dominated by Western countries. What we tell you specifically is a really big example of that is the United States. So instead of having a possibly biased news source, they would prefer that, say, President Trump's delegates are the ones writing the press release. That's absolutely ludicrous. But furthermore, having only one news source is not discourse and not what we should value. But furthermore, they never say why people, they would just report on these radical differences and why people still wouldn't take these statistics and distort them and still do bad things as well. But before I move on.
How are other news sources like the CNN, who are businesses that are funded by by like specific groups and stuff in the USA, and that actually has an effect on what they cover, more legitimate than what you're mentioning the UN.
Because the people in the United Nations still have a political agenda that they intend to pursue. The United States political agenda has always covered the actions that the UN is taking. But the second question that you have to ask yourself in this round is who helps innocent individuals? Now, the first question here is xenophobia. Remember what we tell you. People will hear about terrorist attacks regardless of whether you have the media or not because of word or mouth. My cousins will still fight on Facebook about how they're going to destroy ISIS, whether CNN releases it or not, because people still hear about the terrorist attacks. But the thing is, news media still reports on the statistics, they still report on the details. Word of mouth does none of that. It's infinitely less reliable. But furthermore, what we can see is that when this comes out, you don't only see this impact of xenophobia, you also see outreach. For example, in my home state of Minnesota, there's a very large Somali community. And in response to terrorist attacks by Al-Shabaab, people haven't increased their xenophobia, they've increased community outreach because they understand the importance of education and integration as a response to recruitment and not xenophobia. There's not only one response. But even if you believe what they're saying, the solution to xenophobia isn't ignoring the things like the genocide of the Yazidis, it's combating xenophobia by revealing the truth. But the other layer of helping people that we discuss is support for the victims. Now, we tell you that this happens in a couple of ways. We tell you that it increases awareness of these issues, especially in the West, where we're largely sheltered from these ideas and where we tend not to care about people beyond our borders if we don't hear about it in the media. And yes, we know that sometimes this media coverage is disproportionate. We agree that that's a bad thing, but the solution to disproportionate media coverage is not to have no coverage at all, it's to actually start covering the issues that matter. They're not presenting you with a proper solution. We give you the example early on of how the Bring Back Our Girls campaign raised awareness of terrorism. We tell you, I told you earlier in my speech, how Palestinian victims were given a voice and people actually began to push back government-sponsored terrorism. Without media, this never would have happened. We believe it's crucial. But again, let's quickly talk about the issue of Iraq. We tell you that the reason it happened was about oil and not terrorism, but even if you believe that the media justified U.S. intervention, it was because the U.S. claimed there were weapons of mass destruction held by the government, not because of 9/11. They're giving you the wrong excuse that the United States used. It didn't have anything to do with terrorism. So while it's a horrible tragedy, and we regret it as much as anybody, it's not relevant to this debate. But the third question we have to ask ourselves is who best fights terrorism? Now we tell you that news media can have a rallying effect, because we tell you that without the news media, there would really be no awareness of these crucial issues. Remember the example we give you earlier in the round. After Al-Shabaab killed hundreds of university students, Kenya actually began to fight the terrorist group more actively, instead of allowing them to continue their campaign of violence because of the media. Another example, of decades ago, the Tamil Tigers killed many, many people. India actually fought them, largely eradicating the terrorist group. But furthermore, remember what I told you about the local community in Minnesota. Only because of terrorist attacks have we recognized the importance of reaching out to the Somali community instead of ignoring them and integrating our society, instead of giving that fuel for recruitment that we all fear. But the second issue that we talk about is the issue of recruitment. Remember what we tell you, terrorism news will spread by word of mouth regardless, meaning this fear that they talk about will still be used. But what we need instead is a counterbalance. We need to show the human impact of terrorism and not just the glory and greed that terrorists want you to see. For example, in 1971, the terrorist group Weather Underground bombed the Capitol building, and as a response, they didn't get more recruitment, but everybody abandoned their support of the group because they realized that in the long run, this is irrational and it's dangerous. What the proposition would prefer is that all of the news that you hear is from ISIS's Twitter feed, from what your family says irrationally online, or maybe from a UN press release written by people who have even more of a distinct political agenda than the news has a profit motive. But because we believe that freedom of speech and the rallying effect are better solutions, we strongly oppose.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 3 seconds.
The opposition's reply speakers.
When fighting terrorists who do not believe in basic human rights, we cannot give up the essential freedoms that generations of those around the world have fought to protect. Because we believe in a free press, a free people, and a free society, we are proud to propose. We think that facts always outweigh fear, and thus we support the existence of the media. A couple of things in this speech. I'd like to ask two questions. First, what is the alternative to the media? And second, what kind of discourse does the media create? But first, what is the alternative to the media? On the proposition, they say that the alternative to a bunch of diverse media sources reporting on terrorism, we would just have one UN organization reporting on all of these international events. We, however, think that there should be multiple perspectives involved. We think that in order to promote discourse and to promote real change, you need to have more than one voice in the picture. Furthermore, they say that they want comprehensive coverage of a bunch of different issues. If that's the case, you don't give all of the media responsibilities to one organization. That's just not the way that you promote comprehensive coverage of an issue. For example, the Human Rights Watch cares about human rights violations issues in the scope of broad terrorist attacks, whereas another organization might focus on the perhaps political motivations or financial enablers that enabled the terrorist attack to take place. If you really want to tackle all of the aspects of the terrorist attack and really address in a broad, diverse sense the issues at hand, then you don't hand control over to one news outlet that might have one central perspective. Because yeah, they say that the UN might be neutral, but it is still only one viewpoint. Yes, the UN does represent all countries, but there are definitely countries within the United Nations that are more dominant than others, and those perspectives are going to be the ones that rise to the forefront if the UN is given the responsibility of reporting on these issues. So we think that the solution to perhaps radicalized media perspectives isn't just handing control of coverage over to one organization. We'd also just like to point out that while this is a poor plan, it can't even come into existence on their side because a UN press release is still media. So there are a ton of problems with their model. First of all, it is not really consistent with their side, but even if you do think it is consistent, there are a ton of problems because it doesn't really promote discourse and just fixates on one viewpoint. But we'd like to ask our second question, namely, what kind of discourse does the media create? They say that it paints a huge picture of a sensationalized terrorist organization and perhaps promotes xenophobia because it only offers radical perspectives because the media is trying to pander to its audience and only report on things that people want to hear about. First of all, we don't think that reporting about terrorism is inherently bad. We don't think that reporting about things that people want to hear about is inherently bad. Furthermore, we think that it is better than the alternatives because if you don't have a legitimate media source, then the things that you're going to turn to are things like ISIS's Twitter feed, and if that is the only dominant perspective, if that is the majority of the perspective that you're hearing, that's going to be incredibly damaging. But even if you do think that the media perpetuates perhaps a bit of extremist, sensationalized news, we think that the discourse it creates, the positive discourse, still vastly outweighs. As we brought up throughout our case, we think that combating institutionalized terrorism by reporting on issues and bringing them to the forefront definitely goes a long way to bring those things to an end. If the media hadn't reported on Israel's abuses, they would not have been incentivized to stop doing those things, and they probably would have continued to murder Palestinian civilians if there hadn't been that international backlash caused by the media. Furthermore, it just generally promotes awareness and allows the international community to combat terrorism. Because you can't stop what you don't know about, we are proud to oppose.
Speaking time of 4 minutes and 9 seconds.
Apparently, side opposition lives in a world where the media creates a nuanced, multilateral view on terror issues, where the UN Human Rights Committee has the major voice within our society. They live in a world where a business, CNN or Fox News, creates an objective view on terrorist issues, Mr. and Madam Speaker, that simply is not the reality of the world. And because the reality of the media and the way they portray terrorist attacks is one where they create fear, xenophobia, radicalization, and ultimately more terror, we are so proud to propose. Let's start off by clarifying this idea of who the media is that I mentioned in this introduction. Firstly, they've pretty much just said that it's like this objective, good, varied sources. They've come with a couple of examples, but we think that these are very small scale and very low impact compared to the scale of this debate. We say, where we're looking at the status quo, that medias are businesses, and the nature of media is to gain views. They have not responded to this at all. We have told you about how we look at media through like clickbait and how we look at media through very quick instances. They haven't responded to this at all. But let's talk about this idea of free speech they also brought up. Now, they had a whole point about it and spent a lot of time saying that they stood for free speech and this was an inherent violation. Well, we think that on our side of the house we can have both, but even if you don't buy that, then let's weigh the harms and the benefits of this. Now, we think that in this case, the harms that we've proved throughout the bench outweigh the benefits that you get from freedom of speech. We think that in some cases, it is more harmful to have these media outlets portraying terrorists in these ways than it is to have the freedom of speech. We think we have proved that to you. But let's look at this last thing, which is what this debate was supposed to be about, which is the harms versus benefits of the portrayal of terror in media. The specific things that what this specific case has happened. All right, their side. They had actually very little specific analysis on why specifically terror coverage is good. They had mostly coverage on why free speech is good, which is great. We think we can have that on our side too. But let's look at what they actually did bring. Firstly, they had this idea of the rallying effect. Well, firstly, we think it's just not true in the majority of cases. We think, okay, even if it does good sometimes, we think it's outweighed by the bad. And also we presented to you that ISIS also rallies because of the media, and we think this is more harmful than the good that happens because of people rallying in the West. Second idea they brought, which was this, like, the government takes action, that it was a good way for governments to take action. We presented to you analysis on why governments still will take action. On issues of national security, we think that because it still is a threat, terror, governments are still going to take action without the extensive media coverage. Now, they had these few examples of good, like Malala and education and Bring Back Our Girls, and we are very happy that those few instances have happened. But we think those few instances are far outweighed by the bad. So let's tell you about the harms, the direct things that we have told you. Now, we tell you about fear and how it's created more in this media world because there's so much disproportionate coverage to terrorist attacks. We think this decreases the quality of human life generally, and we also think that it creates like more radical action from people. Now, to tell you about xenophobia and how it leads to violence, we see generally, like with refugees, there's a lot of violence towards them because of their xenophobia. We think the same principle applies within that these media create xenophobia. We talk about radicalization of the Western world. We had this whole third argument they didn't really respond to about how we create more support for terror because we are giving them in their hands what they want, which is attention. We are leading to more terror because we are legitimizing everything that they do through covering in the media. So this legitimization of terror is actually the huge harm that causes us to win the debate. Because we are saying, yes, you are coming and attacking us, and we are going to allow that, we are going to give you exactly what you want out of it. We have by far proved that we have far more harms from this specific situation because they spent 3 minutes of their last speech on criticizing our model, even though this is a principal debate. We think we have clearly taken it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Speaking time was 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for the debate. If you could please wait outside until we
Thank you.